The story of art at the Stuart Court has long been the story of Charles I, but Henrietta Maria also brought a sophisticated understanding of what a magnificent court should look like and how pictures contributed to it. However polarizing she was as a French Catholic, and even if she was not steeped in classical learning, she had a strong sense of taste and a strong sense of purpose, and art was an essential part of this. This paper will consider Henrietta Maria's taste, patronage, and display of pictures. It will highlight her close relationships with a number of artists, her acts of mediation for acquiring artworks for the court, her ordering and gifting of portraits, and her palace display. These choices of artworks seem to have been governed by a strong sense of what was suitable for a Catholic queen consort. That is, chiefly devotional pictures and family portraits. But we will also find suggestions of her own fondness for Italian Baroque painting, especially the works of Orazio Gentileschi and Guido Reni. And while she was largely surrounded in her palaces by Marian imagery and female saints, she did not completely reject mythological painting. She also had landscapes and still lifes. She commissioned pictures and was the recipient of gifts from the king, the papacy, and courtiers. Indeed, and I think as we've already seen in Andrea's brilliant paper, she was quite central to gifts from the papacy. She provided a direct line. It was precisely Henrietta Maria's position between France and England, her own Catholicism and Protestant England, her godfather the Pope and her husband the King, that made her impact on art at the Stuart Court so significant. Henrietta Maria's upbringing at the Bourbon court had a profound influence on her. She had a very dominant mother who had been widowed when Henrietta Maria was just a baby. She had a strong sense of religious obligation and piety, and she was from a sophisticated court that saw the value in magnificent display. When Henrietta Maria was just a teenager, her mother, Marie de' Medici, was overseeing Rubens's spectacular cycle of paintings of her life for her palace. In fact, the unveiling of this cycle of paintings by Rubens took place at the Paris wedding reception of Henrietta Maria and Charles I. Orazio Gentileschi was also in Paris working for Marie de' Medici at the time of the royal marriage. Moreover, Henrietta Maria was raised to see the essential role of artworks within the context of court ritual and claims to power. She learned the role of art within the context of the Mass and in her private devotions, and the ongoing commitment she would need to have to the church as patron. As part of her wedding trousseau, she brought several unnamed pictures to her chapel at St. James's. These must, of course, have been devotional works. This was 1625, and I do not think it has been previously noted that the year of the marriage was a jubilee year, and Pope Urban VIII naturally attached great significance to this and even gave the Queen a rare golden rose. It must have portended so well for the papacy. The year of her arrival in England, Frances Clame painted a crucifixion for the high altar of her chapel at St. James's. And a crucifixion, this is a very strongly Catholic subject. The same year, in 1625, as Sarah Wolfson has recently shown, the king gifted Henrietta Maria a nativity in an ornate triptych or shrine. Nothing like this is recorded in the Stuart inventories, but I'm just showing you something that might be vaguely comparable. This gift speaks of an acceptance on the king's part of the Queen's Catholicism in the important role of religious pictures for her. Henrietta Maria's taste for pictures and orders for them was certainly not limited to religious works. In 1628, Daniel Muytens painted 3 pictures of her with her dwarf, Geoffrey Hudson. No versions of this portrait appear to survive, but this is, of course, Van Dyck's famous 1632 rendition. While the king paid for these 3 portraits by Muytens, none seem to have stayed at court. Instead, they were sent abroad to 3 recipients, all hand-picked by the Queen herself. She also ordered portraits of her children and sent them to relatives abroad, as was the case with this portrait of her 3 eldest children, painted by Van Dyck in 1635 and sent to her older sister Christina in Savoy. The king does not seem to have been very involved in this commission because he complained afterwards about the portrayal of the children. Charles depicted still in his skirts and the others without their protective aprons. This is one of Van Dyck's, well, I certainly think this is one of Van Dyck's finest royal portraits and seems to have been based on a life sitting. And in my mind, it is certainly notable that this quality was seen to be appropriate for a work initiated by the Queen to be sent to her sister. She spent extravagantly on the interiors of her palaces, all exquisitely decorated, often with furniture in the French style, and Somerset House in particular had a lot of furniture in the French style. But at the Queen's house at Greenwich and at Wimbledon, there was a very strong sense of the Italianate in both furniture and pictures. These strongly Italian interiors coincide with the presence of papal envoys at the Stuart Court. From around 1634, there was a far greater boldness to her Catholicism. Papal agents had arrived, and her new chapel, designed by Inigo Jones for Somerset House, opened. For the altarpiece, Charles I bestowed on her a Rubens crucifixion. This gifting of a devotional picture is comparable to the nativity he had given her 10 years prior. But the religious landscape had changed markedly. The theatrical, emotionally resonant aspects of Catholicism were played up in this chapel, as in the spectacular monstrance for the altar by Francois Dussart. A choir was positioned behind the monstrance so that the singing would appear to come from the heavenly host itself at the height of the Mass. This example reveals the strongly Catholic influence of the Queen at court. It also highlights the visual and material splendor of the whole theater of artworks at her chapels, which would have had inevitably close associations with Rome and the papacy. It's worth underscoring here, too, the talent marshaled on the Queen's chapel. The architect was Jones, the altarpiece by Rubens, the monstrance by a sculptor who had been active in Rome and worked in a decidedly Italianate manner. For Protestants, such imagery within the context of the Mass was wholly unacceptable. A crucifixion was a particularly Catholic image, since it emphasized the Eucharist as the body of Christ. Rubens's altarpiece was violently attacked during the Civil War by parliamentarians who scourged it with a halberd and threw it unceremoniously into the Thames. Attacking the picture became a way to attack the Queen, whose Catholicism caused such widespread suspicion and hostility. Her direct line to the papacy was central to securing commissions, including Bernini's bust of Charles I. She sought a bust of Bernini of herself too, which did not eventuate, but 3 preparatory studies by Van Dyck survive. And the papal court, as Andrea told us this morning, sent to Her Britannic Majesty a suite of Italian pictures which arrived in England in January 1636. So all of those pictures that you saw in his chart, they were all unpacked in her bedchamber where she was convalescing. She had just given birth to her second daughter, Elizabeth, and that's where they were unpacked, those works. The connection between the king and the papacy the queen and the papacy at this critical juncture, when they were hoping to convert the king, made such precious gifts of paintings possible. Now you'll recall too from Andrea's paper that he talks about a subsequent gift the same year brought from the second papal envoy, who was George Conn, a separate gift aimed very specifically at Henrietta Maria. And we just know that this was a picture of Saint Catherine. And I'm showing you some versions really of the same type of Saint Catherine by a painter she was clearly very fond of, Guido Reni. When the picture arrived, she insisted that the picture, still unframed, be immediately attached to her bed. And certainly in looking at the inventories, and I think Andrea indicated this as well, there's no picture that perfectly matches this in the Stuart inventories. But I think it's quite interesting that we do find a picture of St. Catherine by Guido Reni in her post-mortem inventory at Cologne. There is further evidence of the centrality of religious imagery, specifically in the bedchamber. Indeed, religious pictures would pervade her rooms throughout her life, particularly images of the Virgin and Child, the Holy Family, Mary Magdalene, and the familiar St. Catherine of Alexandria. Van der Dort's catalogue of pictures at Whitehall records 6 religious pictures that had been specially moved there for another birth, and this was the birth of Catherine in early 1639. These included pictures of the Virgin and Child by Vouet, Raphael, and Van Dyck, as well as Orazio's Rest on the Flight into Egypt. These were, of course, all subjects very suitable for a birthing queen. And what did she name her daughter? Catherine, which suggests, I think, a kind of saintly embodiment. Around this time, the queen was painted by Van Dyck as St. Catherine of Alexandria, claiming both her powers of conversion and her royal pedigree. This, I think, was the queen as the Pope and her mother wanted to see her. Coinciding with all of this was a renewed focus on the Queen's house at Greenwich, designed as a pleasure pavilion for the hunt in the adjacent park. The Queen's house was distinctive both in its form and function from other palace buildings. There were new commissions from Reni, Orazio Gentileschi, and Jordaens, as well as a careful selection of existing works by Gentileschi and Giulio Romano. With its classicizing architecture by Jones, the house was particularly suited to Italianate pictures. And this is the central ceiling painting. Orazio Gentileschi began these paintings. This is a suite of 9 paintings for the main hall ceiling in 1635, and these were completed around 1638. The Queen oversaw the direction of the bedchamber, and as Gordon Higgett has stressed, This is the only surviving example of her interior decoration. She selected Guido Reni for the central ceiling painting, and I should just point out at the outset that this is obviously not a Guido Reni. The picture was never installed, and this central painting was installed in the early 18th century. But she directed the papal agent to mediate with the familiar Cardinal Barberini in Rome to get Guido Reni to paint this. What's more, we know she intended to pay for it herself. She left the subject to the cardinal's discretion, and he chose Bacchus and Ariadne. Completed in 1640, the papal agent was anxious that the picture might appear to be lascivious, and therefore might, in his words, scandalize the heretics in England. But the agent also conceded that if the Queen and her confessor both approved it, then we will have to let it appear that Her Majesty ordered everything and that I was solicitously carrying out her demands, end quote. This incident demonstrates the expected leeway given to the Queen as a patron. Here, as in other instances with Jones, she was given the opportunity to approve or reject a design. And as I mentioned, it was never installed. It does not appear to have ever made it to England. And when she went to exile in France in 1644, not long after, she pawned it. And this is an etching made after it by Bolognini. And what I think you can see is that this Bacchic scene was very much replete with seductive nude figures. But it wasn't just the subject that was problematic in 1640. It was the increasingly tense political situation and the perception of the Queen's role in it. It is notable that the Queen approved amorous imagery in the context of the Queen's house, imagery aligned with the theme of love. That is to say, not all art produced at the height of the Catholic presence at the Stuart Court was devotional. And remember, of course, Barberini is brokering this, and this is not devotional. Moreover, the space, too, proclaims itself to be very much her space. A number of existing Italian paintings were also selected for the Queen's house, including these three by Orazio, Lot and his daughters, Joseph and Potiphar's wife, and the finding of Moses. Henrietta Maria even allowed Gentileschi to be buried under the main altar of her chapel at Somerset House in February 1639. And I think the dating here is important for understanding why Gentileschi is buried there in 1639, because he had just finished all of that work at the Queen's house. To me, it is notable that this growing Italianate focus of her pictures and decoration at the Queen's house, as well as Wimbledon, which she acquired in 1639, all coincides with the presence of papal envoys in England. So this exciting period of the Queen's direction in art and architecture, concentrating on the period 1632 to 40, this produced the Somerset House Chapel, the Queen's House, works by Orazio, Reni, Van Dyck, strategic papal gifts, and ambitious plans for Wimbledon. Really, the pace was unrelenting. When the surveyor of pictures, Van der Dort, produced a catalogue of pictures from around 1639, none of her palaces were included. This could well be because the following year the Queen appointed her own keeper of pictures, Daniel Seurat, and that he was expected to inventory them. This appointment suggests the quality and quantity of artworks in her palaces and a sense of direction and a sense of ownership. There is every suggestion then that Henrietta Maria's directorial role in the appointment of her rooms was growing until it was impeded by the Civil War. Over the next few years, political tensions reached breaking point. The Queen was a figure of hostility with her Catholic conversions at court and her campaign to raise funds for the King's service from English Catholics from Ireland, France, and above all, Rome. By January 1642, she left London for Holland to accompany her daughter to marry the stadtholder's son. And just 2 years later, she fled in exile to Paris, never to see her husband again. As you can imagine, her time in exile was fraught. She struggled not just with the ignominy of exile and the shame of the execution of her husband, but also ongoing financial problems in a period of terrible political unrest in France. Here in exile, she embraced a nun-like persona in portraits where she is shown in widow's weeds and presents herself constantly as La Reine Malheureuse, the miserable queen. When Charles II was crowned in 1660, she was overjoyed. She returned the same year triumphant. She would again embrace architectural patronage, this time on a dramatic scale at Somerset House. And it's always staggering to me to read the figures she spent from her own privy purse on renovating Somerset House. £30,000. Enormous amount of money. There are tantalizing glimpses of her engagement with artworks at the Restoration Court, payments to John Hoskins, payments to John Michael Wright. Pepys regaled the quality of her rooms at Somerset House. When she left London during the plague in the summer of 1665 to return to Paris, an inventory was taken of all the goods she was taking with her. Some were new, others had been discovered and returned to her at the Restoration. This list included a Guido Reni painting of Divine Love, as well as pictures by many of the artists she had shown such a strong interest in the 1630s: Van Dyck, Orazio Gentileschi, Giulio Romano. When she died in 1669 at her chateau at Cologne, an inventory was again taken, and it included all of these pictures, as well as others by the same pictures, including the Reni picture of a Guido Reni painting of St. Catherine, Van Dyck's portrait of the three eldest children, the picture of Charles II as Prince of Wales, and Gentileschi's two pictures, The Finding of Moses and Joseph and Potiphar's wife. And you'll recall that the bottom two pictures, of course, had also hung at the Queen's house at Greenwich. So these are all pictures, all four of these certainly, all had strong links to the Queen, going back to her palaces and her display in the 1630s. Other pictures seem to have been newer acquisitions, including Holbein's Noli Me Tangere. It hung in her cabinet, along with Dow's Tooth Drawer and Domenico Fetti's Eve Spinning. And of these three works, only one was returned to Charles II after her death, and this was the Holbein, which of course features in the exhibition. So the point I'm making here is there seems to have been a relatively fluid understanding of what would become the royal collection. So a lot of her pictures recorded in the post-mortem inventory stayed in France. The returned pictures were redeployed for the English palaces, several naturally displayed at Whitehall. At least one found its way into the custody of Catherine of Braganza, a, quote, Christ and Joseph, one of the Queen Mother's collection. This demonstrates that the artworks inventoried in Paris were still remembered as formerly in her collection. To conclude, Henrietta Maria had a decisive impact on the religious and political landscape, as well as the acquisition of artworks at the Stuart Court. It was her Catholicism which proved so politically divisive for the king, which was instrumental in many ways for the spectacular gifts and commissions brokered through the papacy. The essential role of images, too, within the context of her devotions, also influenced the type of artworks gifted to her by the king, the papacy, and other courtiers. These were the optics that needed to be seen by the English Catholics, the French court, and the papacy. But the accounts actually paint a far more colorful picture. She was thrilled to get her hands on that still unframed picture of St. Catherine, but she was also very keen to get lifelike portraits of her children. She sought a portrait bust of herself from Bernini. Her strong preference for Guido Reni's works, too, suggests taste that extended beyond the largely devotional scope of what was her public identity. Oh, it's not here. Well, indeed, she was also gifted mythological pictures. Basil Fielding gave her a Triumph of Bacchus. Another courtier gave her an Annibale Carracci painting of Narcissus and Echo. And amongst van der Dort's lists of the Queen's pictures that were at Whitehall, not her palaces, he lists 2 fruit still life pictures as well. And of course, throughout her life, she kept close to hand portraits of her children, and until her death, a miniature portrait of her husband. So while she was a deeply polarizing figure at court, she was a very important and is an important historical figure because she was forced to negotiate tense confessional and political issues because she was between France and England, the papacy and Protestantism, royal magnificence, and religious devotion. She was assertive, sophisticated, deeply loyal, and as we have seen, had a keen understanding of how she needed to marshal art for her own direction and use.